Hey everybody, Grommel's here with some more Warthunder gameplay. And this time I thought I'd make a tank video again. Ground Forces went open beta of course, and I played a little bit since then, and one of my goals is to reach the Panzer 38, the Hetzer, to try this new vehicle out. Now I don't have it unlocked yet, as I don't have that much time to play or make videos at the moment, because I have a lot of real life work to do. And that is also why it took a while to make this video. I will be pretty busy for another month or so, in which I can't do that many videos. After that I should be able to play more again and do more videos again as well. But I thought if I make a video in the future about the Panzer 38, it might be nice to make one about the original 38T light tank first anyway. So in this video I will drive and talk about the Panzer 38T, both the A version and the later F version. Now, this small tank, produced originally under the designation TNH by CKD, became a very important tank for the Germans in the early years of the war, and was praised for being one of the most reliable tanks of that period, suffering very little mechanical breakdowns. And that is really what made this tank so valuable at the early stages of the war. With the Wehrmacht being on the offensive with their blitzkrieg tactic, reliability of the vehicles used was an important factor. In this kind of maneuver warfare, it is important to have vehicles that can move long distances without many breakdowns or need for much maintenance. But of course, in Warthunder reliability does not play a role, so let's take a look at the traits of the tank that do play a role in the game. Now let's start with the A version of the tank, which sits on battle rating 1.3 at the moment. In my opinion, this tank is currently one of the most capable, if not the most capable tank at this low battle rating. It has 25mm of armor at the front and 15 at the side and the rear, which is pretty mediocre for this rank. Not bad, but not great either, and also it has a mediocre speed. However, the tank has a very good gun. The Skoda A7 is a 37mm anti-tank gun, so it has the same caliber than the Panzer III version E. However, the A7 gun has a slightly longer barrel and it fires a slightly heavier projectile. So it fires a slightly heavier projectile at about the same speed than the Panzer III's gun, and therefore it has a little bit more armor penetration. But the important part is that the gun has a very good damage potential. If your shots penetrate, you usually do a good amount of damage, and you have a very high chance of one-shots against most targets you meet at this battle rating. The gun has 3 armor-piercing rounds, the standard round that comes with the tank, an armor-piercing capped round, a slightly improved unlock armor-piercing round, a capped ballistic capped round, as well as a APCR round. Now, one interesting thing here is that the standard APC round is one of the very few shells in the game for tanks that does not have a tracer. That makes it harder, of course, to adjust your fire at long range. But on the other hand, you are also harder to spot when you fire. That could come in handy in some situations, though I have to say I have not used this round very often yet. But I think especially in the future, when the minimap icons get removed from simulator battles, having a few of those tracerless standard rounds for ambushes might be a good idea. Now, the tank also has an APCR round, which both the A and the F version can unlock. And that gives the tank a pretty decent armor penetration of about 80mm at 100 meters, at the cost of some damage of course. Now, the penetrating power of this round deteriorates pretty fast at longer ranges, and the reason that the armor penetration of APCR rounds decreases so fast usually is that an APCR round is much lighter than a normal armor-piercing round. This is so that it can be accelerated to a higher muzzle velocity in the barrel, and because the speed is more important than the weight of the projectile for armor penetration and the small penetrator is made out of very hard material, the armor penetration of this round is higher even though the projectile is lighter. However, an APCR round of course has the same diameter than a normal round. It is a small penetrator within a soft metal case, which is about the same size than a normal armor-piercing round. That means the round has the same air resistance than a normal armor-piercing round, and because it is faster, the air resistance is even higher. Now, because the round is lighter, the air resistance has, so to speak, an easier time slowing your projectile down than a heavier normal round, just like the propellant had an easier time accelerating it at first. That is actually a somewhat similar reason as to why a heavier plane can zoom climb better than a lightweight turn fighter. Well, and since the APCR round is lighter, it needs the speed to keep its armor penetration up, and that is why the armor penetration of APCR rounds goes down faster over time than that of a normal AP round. The British 17-pounder had already rounds with discarding sabot available, which would keep the air resistance down, but they had problems with the separation of the sabot influencing the accuracy of the round. Anyway, back to the 38T. Now, while I consider the 38TA one of the best low rank 1 tanks because of its very capable gun, and I think it is a great tank for new players to start the game with, the second version, the F, is somewhat more challenging to drive. Now, the F is almost the same tank than the A. The difference is in the thicker armor. It has 50mm at the front and 30 at the side and rear. That's a nice improvement in armor over the A. However, the F is on battle rating 2, much higher than the A, and it will meet much tougher opposition than the A, including D-34s, which more than makes up for the increase in armor. I still had a lot of fun driving it though. It's far more challenging than the A. Now, it is quite important to have APCR rounds unlocked in the F. You will need it. Thankfully, it is still a rank 1 tank, so unlocking the ammo does not take long. Now, even if you have the APCR rounds, if you meet the D-34, you need to be pretty close to do damage to it, and you need to know weak spot if he turns his front towards you, if you want to have a chance of knocking it out. And this is something where I think a lot of people make a mistake. The well-known weak spot of the D-34 is the driver's hatch. Now, that works just fine if your gun has the necessary penetration to get through the front armor plate. The reason is that, as is usually the case with driver's hatches, there is a driver right behind it, so a penetrating hit of the driver's hatch usually knocks out the driver right away and often comes in at the right angle to have a good chance of doing a lot of damage. So aiming for the driver's hatch usually gets you good results if you penetrate the armor. So in that sense the hatch is a weak spot. The mistake that many people make is that they think the driver's hatch is also easier to penetrate than the rest of the front, and there is no reason for that. Actually, in reality, the driver's hatch of the D-34 was often even thicker than the normal armor. That is not the case in Warthunder though, it is only the same thickness than the rest of the front, but that does not make it any easier to penetrate. Also, the driver's hatch and the frontal armor overlap of course, so forget any ideas that you might be able to push the hatch in or something like that. That means, if your gun does not have the necessary penetration to get through the front hull of the D-34, aiming for the driver's hatch won't change that. The same is true for the T-50 by the way. Now, the real weak point as far as armor penetration is concerned, if the tank is showing you the front, is the same on early T-34s than on the Panther. It is the front of the turret. Now, the turret of the T-34 has the same armor strength than the hull, 45mm. However, the hull is sloped and the turret is rounded. The thing with those rounded turrets is that if you hit them right in the middle, your shell hits without an angle. The armor does not get a slope bonus like the hull front does. So, assuming you face a D-34 head-on, the line of sight thickness of the front, including the driver's hatch, is 90mm. The line of sight thickness of the front of the turret, if you hit the middle, is only 45mm. I will link a picture in the description, which I think will explain this better in case this is not 100% clear. Well, another thing is, the D-34 has of course a small two-man turret, so a penetrating hit on the front has a very good chance to do enough damage that he can't fire back. Thanks to the good slope of the D-34 on all sides, the front of the turret is actually the weakest part of the tank, and you are more likely to penetrate it than the side or the rear. This is true for all the early model D-34s, the prototype, the 1940 L11, the model 1941, and also the non-premium D-34-57, since it also has the old turret. The 1942 and the premium D-34-57 have a newer turret with a thicker armor. So if you face an early D-34 or a T-50 and you have a good gun with enough penetration to get through the front, aiming for the driver's hatch is a good idea, but if you don't bother, aim for the turret instead. A D-34 is of course still a tall order for Panzer 38D, but thanks to the APCR ammo you can fight and defeat them at close range. Luckily, the D-34s do have a slightly higher battle rating than the Panzer 38D, so you won't meet them too often. Since the F is a battle rating 2, your most common adversary is the T-50, which has the same battle rating and is currently one of the most played tanks in the game, I think. Once you have the APCR rounds unlocked though, the T-50 is usually pretty easy to take out at shorter range. You do have to get a bit closer to them thanks to the fast decrease in power at range of the APCR rounds, but the T-50 is usually played as a brawler and in most cases will use its speed to get close to you on its own. On longer ranges the T-50's 45mm gun also has problems penetrating your 50mm of frontal armor. Now, if you don't have the APCR rounds unlocked, which should only be for a few games, you still have a chance to penetrate the T-50's turret at close range if you aim carefully at the front. The same goes for other tanks like the Panzer IV F1 as well. The best chance to damage a T-50 head-on without the heat rounds in this case is by aiming at the front of the turret again. Though the penetration of the standard AP rounds for the L24 cannon is so bad that you need to be lucky in this case too. Another thing that you can do is try to get on the high ground and shoot down at a tank like a T-50 or a T-34. Most of their armor strength comes from the slope of the armor. A T-50 has 40mm of armor, the T-34 45mm, both thinner than the 38T's 50mm. If you manage to negate the slope of the armor by, for example, hanging off a cliff firing down, even a small gun can get through those tanks. Of course, that requires your opponents to be nice enough to sit around next to a hill until you can do that, but it is something to keep in mind. Well, that were some thoughts on the 38D. Now, another thing I wanted to share some thoughts about is events for ground forces. Now, as you may know, I recently started flying simulator battle events in the air part of the game, and I have to say, since I started flying events, I really started to prefer them over the normal queue. The more realistic matchups and for air simulator usually very full matches make, at least for me, a very enjoyable experience. Not surprisingly, I would like to see similar events for tanks as well. I think the difference between the queue and events for tanks would be even bigger than for planes, because I think there is an additional problem when it comes to realism for matchups with the normal battle rating system when it comes to tanks compared to planes, and that is that tanks stayed in service for a lot longer than planes. What I mean is, for example, sure, in 1945 the Germans had King Tigers, Jagd Tigers and Jagd Panthers, and the Russians IS-2s and ISU-122s. But none of those vehicles were the most common at the time. The most common tanks for the Germans were still the Panzer IV and the Stuck 3, and for the Russians D-34 76mm were still very common. For planes that is not the case, at least not to the same extent. 109Gs and Ks pretty much replaced 109Es and Fs, just like they replaced them in the queue in Warthunder. But the Panther never fully replaced the Panzer IV, and the Jagd Panther of course never replaced the Stuck 3. The smaller vehicles were much more common even in the last year of the war, so for me having high-tier teams with only high-tier vehicles actually does not feel that realistic. Now, I know that it is of course necessary for balancing in the normal queue, and that is why I like to see events for tanks soon. I think it would be nice to have a mix between the more common vehicles of the time, with a smaller number of the really powerful ones that were already in service. A common example for this would be a Kursk event, where the majority of the tanks are still Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs on the German side, maybe even a few Panzer 38Ts. But also a small number of Tigers and Panthers, maybe 2 or 3. So a mix of tanks that you would not see with the normal battle rating system, just like in the events for planes. Now, there is one problem with this though. In this case, the high-tier tanks of course would need to be capped at a certain number. And I know that the event mode system already has this capability. The question is though, how would you stop people from queuing up in only the strongest tanks? If we have such a Kursk event, for example, and let's say there are only 2 Tiger slots in the team and 12 Panzer III and Panzer IV slots, it is the sad truth that most people will go for the easiest route, so it is to be expected that almost everybody queues up in a Tiger. So let's say you have 20 people queuing up for this team, but 50 of them are in a Tiger and only 5 of them are in the Panzer III. So even though there are enough people for the game in theory, they are in the wrong tank and the game would never start. I think World of Tanks Historic Battles had a similar problem, so I actually think that the event system needs to be a bit adjusted to take this into account. An idea that I have would be to allow or even require people to select more than one slot to queue up for such an event. So you can have your Tiger, but also a Panzer III or IV in your lineup. If you're lucky, the game lets you drive the Tiger. If others are selected to drive the Tiger, you will have to drive a Panzer III or IV. Now, some might argue that this is unfair towards people that want to only drive the Tiger and nothing else, but there would be the normal queue for that. Otherwise, with so many people wanting to drive the biggest tank you can, I don't see an event like Kursk with a realistic matchup ever happening. Sure, you could balance it in another way, with different team sizes, so everybody gets to drive his Tiger on Kursk, but it is 5 Tigers versus 15 T-34s. But again, that would not be a realistic matchup in my opinion. The Germans had more Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs than Tigers at Kursk, so I want to see more Panzer IIIs than Tigers on the German team on a map like Kursk. What do you think? How would you get around the whole everybody just wants to play the biggest tank thing in such an event? Well, that's it for this video. I hope it was somewhat informative and enjoyable. Thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.